Hey guys, this is Knife Steel Part 2 of my mini series that I'm kind of trying to put together about knife steel. I'm going to put a link to Part 1 somewhere on here. If you haven't seen Part 1, you might want to check it out. The point of these videos is if you're a knife purchaser or a knife user, to help you understand what goes into the knife that you're buying or you bought, and just inform you as a consumer. I'm going to try to address the question which steel is better, but if you watch Part 1, you know that that's a really hard question to answer, and I'll talk about that a little bit during this video. So I'm going to do a quick review of Part 1. And then I'm going to talk about 4 categories of steel that are used in knife making. You can see in the lower left is plain carbon steel, and then above that is alloy steel, and upper right is tool steel, and then the last one will be stainless steel. And then there's a few final thoughts I want to talk about, and then we'll wrap up the video. So to review from Part 1, basic steel is just iron and carbon. Those are the two ingredients you need, and you can make steel. People decided to get fancy over the years, and they added iron and carbon with another element. So when you add another element, you create some kind of special property. And these are the most common elements: manganese, nickel, chromium, molybdenum, vanadium, silicon, and boron. But there are many more things you can add to iron and carbon to give it some kind of special quality. So if you add these elements, what do they do to the steel exactly? Well, most of them either make it harder or make it tougher. There's other things that can happen as well, but these are the two main things that happen if you add an element into iron and carbon. I talked about the difference between being harder and tougher a lot in Part 1. I'll just go over it briefly here. When you have a very hard steel, it will hold a sharp edge for a long time, which is great. You don't have to sharpen it that much. The downside to a very hard steel is it's so hard that it could chip if you're using it for any type of chopping. If you end up hitting material harder than what it was designed to handle, it could chip and you actually lose metal. And the other downside is it's difficult to sharpen an incredibly hard knife or an incredibly hard steel. It's resistant to whatever you're using to sharpen it. There's a couple bullet points. So over on the other side, to make a blade tougher, which some of these elements do, think of toughness as flexibility. A tough piece of steel can be bent out of shape, and it'll return to its original shape and still be strong. The downsides of having a tough knife, a tough piece of steel, is that it dulls much more quickly than a harder type of steel. It's also easier to sharpen though. And this is something, if you look around online while you're looking at a new knife, you'll hear guys say, this knife never needs sharpening. Or you'll hear them say, this knife is very easy to sharpen. It's just, it takes 15 minutes and it's back to razor sharp. So all those comments that you hear are talking about being harder or being tougher. The take-home point here is, and this is from Part 1, you cannot have an incredibly hard knife that's also incredibly tough. They are two different things. And some steel types have found an excellent balance between the two, and I'll point out a few of those. And some knives don't. And sometimes it's on purpose, depending on what the knife was made for. Some other things that these elements do when they're added, some make it withstand high temperatures, some elements protect the steel from corrosion, and some increase wear resistance. And then that key point, which I just talked about, you can't have both. You can't have an incredibly hard and incredibly tough knife. Okay, so let's go over to plain carbon steel. This is the most common steel for knives. This is plain carbon steel, is just basic steel. Nothing has been added to it to enhance it in any way. There's a typical range for carbon steel, and you'll see this stamped on the blade. It's usually from 1045 to 1095. So the next time you see one of these 4-digit codes stamped onto a blade, you'll know what it means. The last 2 digits are the amount of carbon in the steel. So 1045 would be 0.45% carbon, and a 1095 is 0.95% carbon. The 0.95 is common for a lot of knives, and that's considered a high carbon blade. So when you're shopping around and you see a knife that says high carbon steel, this is what they're talking about. There's just a fairly high level of carbon in the steel. Steels can go below 1045. The 0.45% is basically the mid-range of carbon. Less than that would be a low carbon steel, and they are not used for knives. So carbon, what does it do? The higher the carbon amount, the better edge retention or hardness, but it's not a very tough blade. So you have to keep that in mind. These blades will also rust unless it's coated with something. You'll see a lot of knives for sale that have that Duracoat stuff. They might be painted, they might be powder coated. That's usually done to prevent rust. So if you have one of these knives, if you have a plain carbon steel knife, even high carbon, you're gonna have to keep it clean. And there's lots of stuff you can buy to put a protective layer on, lubricants, all sorts of stuff. But something to keep in mind if it's going to be in a very wet environment for a long time, or if it's going to be in storage for a long time out in a garage. Here's an example of a high carbon knife. This is the Schrade Extreme Survival Knife. You can see it's a 1095 high carbon steel blade, so we know that it's 0.95% carbon. This knife usually gets very good reviews. I don't have any experience with it. I just picked it as an example. And then let's move up to alloy steel. So alloy steel is your basic carbon steel with something mixed in to enhance its performance. What that something is it could be any of the elements that we talked about a few minutes ago. Or it could be one that I didn't mention. There are so many, it's hard to keep track, and they all kind of do something a little different. So I wanted to answer this question before we talk any more about alloy steel. What's the difference between alloy steel and stainless steel? It has to do with the chromium content. So alloy steel will have less than 10.5% chromium content. That's an approximate number. Some people say 12% chromium and lower. It's in the ballpark. So alloy steel has less than 10-12% chromium content. Stainless steel, the thing that makes stainless steel stainless is chromium. So if it's comprised of 10 or 12% chromium or higher, it's a stainless steel. And then the example for an alloy is this Buck Knives Hoodlum. It's their very large outdoor survival knife. It's 5160 carbon steel. This survival knife has gotten excellent reviews. There's a lot of reviews on YouTube, and if you haven't checked out this for outdoor survival, I encourage you to. It's a little pricey, but you get a lot for what you pay. I think it's around between 130 and 145 usually. Okay, and next is tool steel. Tool steel is a class of steel that is designed to be hard, resist abrasion, and sometimes hold up to high temps. So drill bits are a great example. Dies for cutting is another example. What else? Hand tools, axes, pickaxes, mining tools, things that are going to be abused and probably get into high temperatures. I'm going to talk about heat treatment again because if you watch part 1, you'll know that I think it's one of the most neglected areas of knife reviewing. For tool steel, since they stand up to such extreme abuse, if the steel was not properly heat treated, you are going to have a broken tool on your hands. And if you're doing yard work with a hatchet and it breaks, probably not a big deal. If you are a miner down in a mine and something important breaks, it is a big deal. So quality is important here, depending on what you're doing with the tool. I already talked about this, but these can be hard to sharpen because they're so hard. If you ever had a quality axe, you'll see a lot of people sharpen those on grinders or grinding wheels because it's so hard. Doing it by hand is quite a task. Here's an example of a tool steel used in a knife. It's the K-Bar D2 Extreme Fighting Utility Knife. This is on Amazon. $107. This is D2. D2 steel is considered a tool steel because it's so hard. So if you're shopping for a knife and you're looking at this one, thinking about buying it, then you now know if you buy this knife, it's going to be very durable because it's a very hard steel, but it's going to be a pain to sharpen. If it was properly heat treated, it's going to be a pain to sharpen. So you know that going in. Okay, and the last section here is stainless steel. You can see down at the bottom, I'm going to talk about 4 stainless steels that are extremely popular in knife making right now, and they have been for a few years. As I mentioned, what makes stainless steel stainless is its chromium content. So you have iron, you have carbon, and then you have chromium added. Now if you don't meet this 10.5 to 12% checkpoint or line for chromium, it's not stainless. So you have to have at least 10 or 12% chromium. Stainless steel is popular because it does not corrode, rust, or stain easily. That means if you make a knife out of this steel, you do not have to put a coating on it, and you don't have to worry about it rusting or corroding if you get it wet and don't wipe it off immediately, or if you store it in a damp environment, a humid garage, whatever the case may be. Why doesn't it corrode, rust, or stain? If there's enough chromium, the blade will basically have a film of chromium oxide which protects it. So you don't need to add anything to it, although you can if you want. So the first steel type that I'm going to talk about is 154 CM. This is considered a high quality steel. Actually, all 4 of the ones that I picked, you can see 8CR, 14 MOV, AUS 8, and S30V. These are all very popular steel types right now. 154 CM is popular because it's considered to have a good balance between hardness and toughness. Meaning it's hard enough to hold an edge, but it's not so hard it'll chip, break, or it's very difficult to sharpen. And it's tough because it has some flexibility. Knife example, the Benchmade Griptilians are 154 CM. These are excellent knives. This has been my everyday carry knife for probably 7 or 8 months. This knife replaced the SOG Aegis which I carried before. The SOG Aegis, I had a lot of trouble with the lockup mechanism. It actually failed on me after 3 months of pretty light use. I ended up returning it and replacing it with this Griptilian, the full-size Griptilian. The only thing I don't like about this knife is the handle. It feels like cheap plastic, but I can live with it because it's an excellent knife. The next one over, 8CR14MOV. This is a more inexpensive steel. This is probably the least expensive out of these four that I'm reviewing under stainless. It's very similar to AUS 8, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. This steel, the 8CR, is made in China. It generally gets very good reviews. I know a lot of guys don't like buying knives made in China, and I don't have an argument for that. But it seems that this steel type, they've really gotten down to a science, and they produce it well. So if you do buy it, you're getting a pretty nice steel at a low cost. CRKT is one of the companies that uses 8CR14 a lot, and I think it's a good decision for them because their price point is so low, and you get a lot for what you're paying for. This is their the CRKT Ripple with the black aluminum handle. There's 2 tiers of this knife. This is the cheaper one. The more expensive one has a better steel. I can't recall off the top of my head what it is. But this, when I took this from Blade HQ, $37 for this knife. And you get a lot for $37. This is a great little knife. And it's the 8CR. It's a good steel. Yeah. And then the next one over, AUS 8. This is a Japanese steel. And kind of the I guess the thing that makes this steel different is they added vanadium to it, and it increases wear resistance. Considered an excellent steel. This is the Ontario Rat one for $28, almost $29. I think this is from Cutlery Shop. An excellent knife. AUS 8 gets good reviews across the board. Another good stainless steel. And then the last one is S30V. This steel is unique because it's the only steel that I've read about that was specifically made for knives. All these other steel types that we've covered and talked about and you've heard about are steels used for other things. S30V was made to be a knife steel, and a lot of people get excited about that idea, and I don't blame them. It's expensive, but it's also considered high quality. There's a lot of mixed reviews online. Most of them are very favorable, but some people don't like it. Some of the complaints that I've heard about it is it's tough to sharpen, but I don't know if that's for all S30V steel. Your mileage may vary. Here's a Spyderco Paramilitary G10 from Amazon, $205, almost $206. This has S30V. The Spyderco Paramilitary is one of the most popular knives among, I guess, die-hard knife collectors. It's an incredible knife, and part of why it's incredible is the S30V steel. So those are the 4 categories of steels that I'm going to talk about. Here's a few final thoughts, and then I'm going to end this video because it's almost 20 minutes. So a couple steels that we didn't mention above. Damascus. Damascus, you probably, if you're watching this video, you probably know what Damascus is. But basically it's hammering a steel so thin that you can fold it over onto itself, hammering it thin again, folding it over onto itself. As far as I can tell, the Damascus, this method of creating a blade steel, was started around the 11th century, so a long time ago. The Damascus blades are anytime you see in like a movie or even a cartoon of a human hair just resting on the edge of a blade and the human hair being split in half, that's the folklore surrounding Damascus. Anytime if you ever see a movie where someone cuts a gun in half with a knife, that's part of the folklore of Damascus. It's considered this incredible steel that could withstand so much abuse and never need sharpening. From what I've read, Damascus was originated somewhere in the Middle East many years ago, and they kept the process such a secret that to this day we don't know how they were making those blades. So you'll see Damascus knives for sale, but they are using a technique that people later on came up with. It is not the same technique as what they did in the Middle East. Part of the reason for that is we have plenty of technology nowadays. However, you don't know what kind of heat treatment they put a steel through, and you probably don't know how many times they folded the steel over, and you don't know, well, you do know what they mixed into it because we can figure that out, but the rest is a mystery. So just know if you're buying a Damascus blade now, it is not the thing that folklore is made of. You're buying a modern version, and your mileage may vary. The next thing I had in here is samurai blade forging. I wanted to include this because the samurai blade has an as interesting history as Damascus. What I've read online about samurai blades is what they used to do to make these blades incredibly strong is they would do differential heat treatment. So way back when they would heat these blades, what they would do is they would protect the spine of the blade with something. I've read that they use like clay, and they would just wrap the spine of the blade, the back of the blade, with clay and then heat it. So they'd be heating the sharp part of the blade and protecting the spine of the blade. So the point of this differential heat treatment is to make the spine of the blade flexible so it doesn't break if you hit something very hard, and then make the actual sharp edge of the blade incredibly hard so it stays incredibly sharp and can chop through things. And I just thought this is a fascinating idea of heat treatment because it's so unusual. And you can see in this picture what steel can look like if you do differential heat treatment. You can see the texture of the steel actually looks different on the two parts. This is a modern blade. So the differential heat treatment we have available now is a lot different than what used to be available. Heat treatment I've kind of been talking about. I talked about it a lot in the part 1 video. Here's the main reason why I have a really hard time picking one steel over another. You can have a cheap piece of steel properly heat treated that'll be better than a piece of steel that's 3 or 4 times more expensive. How do you know what kind of heat treatment the knife that you want to buy got? You don't. Unless the guy you're buying it from did it himself, you don't know. That's why you can see down at the bottom using Google. I'm going to talk about that in a second too. But that's why usually when a new knife comes out and I'm excited about it, I wait for reviews. This is the same thing like buying a car the first year that it's released. There's usually going to be defects and problems and recalls. So there's nothing wrong with buying a car as soon as it's released. You're the first person to have it, but you also don't know exactly what you're getting. And I feel the same way about knives. Once people start buying a particular knife, you'll start seeing on the forums, this is a great blade, resharpens easily. I haven't had to sharpen it in 5 months of hard use. And that's kind of how I learn about these things. You just don't know what kind of heat treatment these blades went to. That's why usually I don't agree with brand loyalty. We all know some people who buy things from a certain company because that's their company. They just like it. With knives, I do believe in brand loyalty. Once you find a knife maker that consistently finds good steel to use, you can kind of trust them to continue doing that. They have some kind of method down for finding good blade steel. The next thing down, ceramic. I have a ceramic cooking knife, and I loved it for the first year that I had it. Supposedly you can sharpen a ceramic knife. I can't. I don't know if it's me or if it's the fact that it's ceramic. So with my kitchen knife, it was incredible for the first year. Ceramic knives are incredibly hard, but what happened is I chipped it a few times and there's no repairing it. So eventually I'm going to have to throw it out. Another nice thing about ceramic knives, it's ceramic, so it can be wet all day. It's not going to corrode, rust, or anything else. And then the last thing I'm going to return to is using Google to help you find a good knife. Do your research, because D2 steel from one knife company is not the same D2 steel from another. So if you're thinking about buying a knife, Google it. Just Google sharpening the Spyderco Mannix and read what people have to say. Watch videos on YouTube, people reviewing. And most importantly, I think, take everything you hear with a grain of salt. Because somebody with an S30V steel blade from one company who doesn't like it because it's too hard to sharpen is not going to be the same from S30V from a different company, because they probably bought the steel from different places and they've been heat treated differently. So anytime someone makes a blanket statement that says AUS 8 is the best steel ever because it's strong and it's hard, take it with a grain of salt. Even though I think AUS 8 steel is wonderful, it's not the same from every company that you'll get it from. And that is what makes buying a new knife difficult if you want the best you can get for your money. It's so hard to tell, and these are the reasons why. Okay, so this video is about almost 28 minutes now. If you watched the whole thing, thank you. If I missed something that you feel is important, leave a comment and let me know. And thanks for watching, guys.